We are going to spend just a little bit of time here in chapter 4. If you had Biology 101 or previous biology courses, this will be a review. But just before we get into all the different tissues that we will cover this semester, want to make sure that you are familiar with the terms that go along with it. One of the basic things to understand is what's referred to as the cell theory, and this just gives rise to our understanding of what cells are. And the cell theory states three main things. First of all, in order to be considered living, all organisms have at least one or more cells. So we'll be talking about prokaryotic cells, and those are cells that only have one cell. That's the entire organism. And then we'll talk a lot about animals and plants, which have many, many cells. But in order to be considered a living thing, you have to have at least one cell. And the second kind of goes along with that. So the cell is the smallest living thing. We will talk a little bit about viruses at the end of this semester. And viruses certainly impact living things, but they themselves are not considered living because they are not cells. They don't have all the cell parts. And then the main part of the cell theory is that cells come from pre-existing cells. They don't spontaneously generate, they have to divide and come from other cells. The plasma membrane is one of the things that all cells have. We'll talk about prokaryotic and eukaryotic, but all cells have what's referred to as a plasma membrane, and it follows what's referred to as the fluid mosaic model. But this plasma membrane is essentially a sheet of two layers of lipids called phospholipids. We'll look at it here in just a second, with other components called membrane or embedded proteins. And this lipid layer is what forms the foundation. So it separates the inside and the outside of the cell. So it's the boundary of the cell. And it's going to determine what comes in and what goes out. So it's kind of a gatekeeper. And again, the main part of this plasma membrane, also called a cell membrane, are what are called phospholipids. And a picture here shows what a phospholipid is. Phospholipids are unique. They are lipids, which means they don't like water. But they do have a part that does. So hydrophilic means water-loving, hydrophobic, water-fearing. So phospholipids have what's referred to as a head region that is polar, or it likes water because it has a phosphate group that can interact with water. And then it has these two hydrophobic, water-fearing fatty acid chains. And this is what makes the molecule mainly hydrophobic or afraid of water. So we refer to this as having a polar head, which is here, and then two tails typically. Sometimes we'll say non-polar, but typically we just say two tails. And that is what these are pointing to here that stick out. So these are going to come together to form this membrane. So what the membrane actually looks like, so the inside, because we'll have two layers of this bilayer, we'll see a picture here next, but we have two of these layers. So that means the inside, the middle of this bilayer, again, bi meaning two, but the inside is completely nonpolar. Again, nonpolar just means it doesn't like water. And this is what allows it to be that gatekeeper. Because no molecules that like water are going to be able to freely cross it. So things like proteins and sugars, DNA, nucleotides, any of that, the majority of things the cell comes in contact with likes water. So they can't freely pass through the membrane. They have to be transported across. And we'll get more into that, especially later whenever we're talking about the respiratory system, and some of the other systems as we go. We'll kind of come back to this transport. And then there is one other component, cholesterol. Of course, cholesterol has kind of a bad rap because too much is a bad thing. However, we do need a little bit of cholesterol that's in there. It affects the fluidity, which just means how movable the membrane is. So it does that. So it is good to have some of that so that the membrane is flexible. However, if it accumulates too much, if our diets have too much cholesterol in them, then it does kind of clump together and it forms plaques. And those plaques then can lead to cardiovascular disease. So again, we'll talk more about that whenever we get to the cardiac system. And here's a picture of that lipid bilayer. So again, we have these two layers of phospholipids. So in this case, the heads that like water kind of pointing out, they're hanging out with water-loving molecules. And then there's another layer as well where those heads are pointing out. So that means the inside here where those tails come together, this is a non-polar region. It doesn't like water. So if we have, say, glucose that's hanging out here and it wants to come in, it can hang out here with these heads, but it's not going to be able to cross through that tail region where those tails are sticking together. All right, so then the two main classes of cells that we talk about are prokaryotic and eukaryotic. And pro just means before, and we're essentially talking about before a nucleus. So it lacks a nucleus, which is an organelle, kind of like a room in a house that has a specific function. So there are no kind of rooms in the house of prokaryotic cells. Everything is just hanging out in the inside of the cell. So there are no internal membranes. They have the plasma membrane to separate the inside and the outside, but they don't have other membranes. And this is what bacteria and archaea are. We won't talk a whole lot about the archaea or the archaea, but we will focus on the bacteria, especially later in the semester. And then for this class, we're mainly focusing on eukaryotic cells because we're mainly focusing on plants and animals. And prokaryotic cells do have a nucleus and a lot of other membrane compartments called organelles. So like mitochondria, the Golgi, lysosomes, lots of membranes, lots of kind of rooms inside of this house of their cell. So all other organisms, so again, plants, animals, fungi, protists, they are all eukaryotic. So the prokaryotic cells are referred to as the simplest cellular organisms. That does not mean that they can't do complex things. They can still go through respiration, and some of them even go through photosynthesis, but they are lacking those internal compartments or those organelles. However, they often do have a few things outside of that plasma membrane. Many of them have a cell wall, which is a more rigid structure. The membrane is real flexible, but the cell wall, because many of them are single-celled, they need a little bit of protection. So that cell wall helps give protection. And then a lot of them, especially those that cause disease, have a capsule, which is made up of a sugary layer, and that helps them stick. It also helps prevent our immune system from seeing them and attacking them. Then inside of the cell, they have cytoplasm. This is another thing that all cells have. So they all have a membrane. They all have this cytoplasm, which is just the fluid inside of the cell. And then they all also have ribosomes. And this is where proteins are made, because all cells need to be able to make proteins. So they need these ribosomes. They're structurally a little bit different. They're a little smaller in prokaryotic than eukaryotic cells, but all cells have ribosomes to make proteins. And then the last thing that all cells have is DNA. Now, where the DNA is found is different. So in prokaryotic cells, again, there's no nucleus to separate it in a membrane. It just hangs out in a region called the nucleoid region. But again, there is no membrane around that. So it's not a nucleus. It's just where the DNA kind of hangs out together. So again, all cells have DNA. They all have cytoplasm. They all have ribosomes. And they all have a cell membrane or plasma membrane. The prokaryotic cells can also have a few other things that can help them move. Many of them have a flagella, or flagellum is singular. And this is kind of like a long tail-like structure. And they can either have one or they can have lots of them on the cell. But this helps them to move. So it just propels them forward. And then some of them also can have pili, which is plural, or pilus, singular. They're really short projections that stick out. And they mainly help with attachment. They help a little bit with movement, but mainly attachment. And also they can exchange genetic information. And this is where like antibiotic resistance becomes an issue because they can share that information. And here's just kind of a typical prokaryotic cell. Again, that nucleoid region here where the DNA is hanging out. All of this blue in here, this is just representing the cytoplasm, the fluid inside of the cell. Each of the little circles here, those are ribosomes, where those proteins are made. Again, the short projections here, those would be the pili, whereas a long, more tail-like structure, that would be the flagellum. The white layer here is indicating the plasma membrane that separates the inside and outside. And then many prokaryotic cells have this thicker cell wall that's shown kind of in the purple color. And then again, many of them outside of that even have another layer called the capsule that's sugary and kind of helps them stick. All right, now on to our eukaryotic cell. Typically, these eukaryotic cells are going to be much larger because they have all of these different organelles, all these different rooms, so it makes for a bigger house. And again, more complex as far as having the ability to kind of carry out more functions. So again, still the plasma membrane that encases or encloses that cytoplasm. All cells have both of those. But again, here the eukaryotic cells are going to have these organelles, these membrane-bound compartments, again, kind of room inside of the house. And they also have what's referred to as a cytoskeleton, which is kind of seen in prokaryotic cells, but much less advanced. And it's just kind of a system, a scaffold that gives structure to the cell so it doesn't collapse on itself and allows movement from the different organelles within the cell. Right, so some of the unique things, so not all eukaryotic cells are the same. So some of them, so plants, we'll be learning more about plants later in the semester, fungi as well. And some protists, they have a cell wall very similar to many prokaryotic cells outside of that plasma membrane that gives them a rigid structure. Plants and some of the protists can go through photosynthesis, so they have chloroplasts to do that. Plants also have kind of a storage unit called a central vacuole, and then animal cells have centrioles. All right, and here's kind of the typical animal cell, so lots of these membrane-bound organelles. So again, our nucleus here where the DNA is stored, then these membranes that come out here, the rough ER, which is where ribosomes are attached for protein function. Then there is a smooth where it looks like the rough ER, but there are no ribosomes, so it appears smooth. That's more where the carbs and the lipids would be made. And again, still have ribosomes either attached to the rough ER like we see here, or just free floating inside of the cell. The Golgi, this is where things are modified, packaged, and kind of distributed, kind of like the up center. Everything comes to the Golgi to get taken to where it needs to go. Lysosomes get used are kind of the trash can where things get broken down. Mitochondria we'll learn more about with the aerobic respiration. That's where a lot of our ATP, a lot of our energy comes from in order for the cell to do all the things that it needs to do. And of course, the animal cell, the most outer layer is the plasma membrane. There's no cell wall or anything outside of it. That membrane is the outermost part. Then our plant cell, a lot of the same. Again, we still see the nucleus in plants, the smooth ER, the rough ER, still have mitochondria and lysosomes, but they have chloroplast, which is what gives them the green color. That's where photosynthesis occurs. And they have the central vacuole that fills up with water that helps push the membrane out against the cell wall, stores some of the food, some of the nutrients for them that they can then use later on. And again, they still have the cell or the plasma membrane kind of thinly shown there. But then they have a thicker cell wall like we saw with the prokaryotic cells. They give them a little bit more structure and support.